Maya Thompson stood outside the Grand Regency Hotel, clutching a tattered leather journal like it was a shield. 9 years old, invisible to the elites in their tailored silk, just another homeless kid seeking warmth near the exhaust vents. Nobody knew she could read a battlefield. Her father, a master sergeant taken by a roadside IED 3 years ago, had spent every evening teaching her the language of tactical ciphers and military codes. Now, it was just Maya and the cold pavement, surviving on the instincts of a soldier's daughter. So Maya watched, and she listened. She had seen the hotel's most dangerous guest exactly twice, Junho Kang, young, powerful, and calculated. He was the kind of man who viewed the world as a chessboard and people like Maya as empty spaces. His driver moved with a rigid, military precision that others mistook for discipline, but Maya recognized the stance of a man on a mission. At 5:41 p.m., she saw a discarded slip of paper flutter from the driver's pocket. Most would see trash. Maya saw a decrypted kill zone sequence, a tactical strike set for the moment a target entered a vehicle. Her blood ran cold as she realized the black luxury sedan at the curb was a hollowed-out tomb. 5:30 p.m., exactly 19 minutes before the strike, Junho Kang stood in his glass-walled penthouse, looking down at the city he controlled. At 34, he was self-made and utterly ruthless. He had built his syndicate on cold logic and zero sentiment. To him, people were either assets or liabilities. Trust was a tactical error he never made. He didn't know that in less than 20 minutes, his life would depend entirely on the one person he had never bothered to see. Maya Thompson didn't just walk the streets, she patrolled them. To the average passerby, she was a smudge of gray against the limestone walls of the Grand Regency, a small girl in a faded hoodie whose presence was as unremarkable as a pigeon on a ledge. But beneath the hood, Maya's eyes were sharp, constantly scanning for points of egress and potential threats, terms she had memorized from the leather-bound journals tucked tightly against her ribs. Those journals were all that remained of Sergeant Marcus Thompson. They were filled with dense, handwritten notes on tactical surveillance, encrypted ciphers, and the discipline of a man who had spent his life protecting others. When the knock on the door had come 3 years ago, the one with the two soldiers in dress blues, Maya's world had fractured, but she had refused to let it shatter. She had taken his books, his lessons, and his legacy into the shadows of the city. Every evening, as the damp chill of the city settled into her bones, Maya would find a sliver of light under a street lamp and study. She learned that the world was a series of codes. Traffic patterns were logistics. The way a man held his briefcase was a tell of his level of authority, and the silence between two guards was often louder than a shout. Her father had always told her that a good soldier isn't just someone with a weapon, but someone who sees what everyone else chooses to ignore. On the streets, being invisible was her greatest tactical advantage. She lived in the blind spots of the wealthy, watching the ebb and flow of power from the curb. She knew which drivers were lazy and which ones were alert. She knew that the man who owned the hotel, Junho Kang, was a high-value target in any theater of operation, though he didn't know it. To him, the sidewalk was a void, and Maya was a part of that void. She didn't mind. She was a soldier's daughter, and she was on watch, waiting for the one moment where the codes of the street would reveal a truth that no one else was brave enough to decipher. In the silence of the city, she wasn't just surviving. She was holding the line, waiting for the signal that would change everything. Inside the glass and steel fortress of the Grand Regency, time didn't move. It was managed. Junho Kang stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, a space as sterile and imposing as his reputation. At 34, he had mastered the art of the calculated life. To Junho, the world below was not a collection of stories or people, but a grid of variables to be optimized. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal gray suit, the fabric perfectly tailored to hide the tension he carried in his shoulders. His life was governed by a singular, unwavering principle: predictability is power. If he could control the clock, he could control the outcome. Sentiment was a luxury for those who didn't have empires to protect, and trust was a variable he had long ago scrubbed from his equations. He didn't need to trust people when he could rely on their greed or their fear. His phone vibrated on the mahogany desk with a dull, rhythmic thud. A text from his driver, Chin. Vehicle secured. T-minus 10 minutes. Junho didn't reply. He simply glanced at the Patek Philippe on his wrist. It was 5:50 p.m. exactly on schedule. For the last 3 years, Junho had exited the building at the same minute, walked the same path through the lobby, and entered his car at exactly 6 p.m. To others, this level of routine seemed like a vulnerability, but to Junho, it was a display of dominance. He was a man so powerful that the world had to adjust to his pace. He picked up his sleek black briefcase, the weight of it familiar and grounding. It contained the documents that would finalize his acquisition of a rival shipping firm by morning. Another move on the board. Another victory for logic over emotion. As he stepped into the private elevator, the silence was absolute. He caught his reflection in the polished chrome doors, eyes that were sharp, dark, and utterly devoid of warmth. He viewed his security team not as men, but as highly calibrated hardware. Chin, the driver who had served him for 5 years, was a reliable component in his daily machine. As the elevator descended, Junho felt the familiar sense of detachment wash over him. He was ready to transition from the sanctuary of his office to the safety of his armored sedan. He had no reason to suspect that the machine he had built was about to malfunction. He had no reason to believe that the tiny, hooded figure he had walked past 100 times was currently the only person on Earth who knew that his 6 p.m. departure was no longer a routine, but a countdown to his own execution. To Junho Kang, the street was just a distance to be crossed. He was about to find out that the most dangerous distance in the world is the gap between what a man sees and what he refuses to look at. The damp evening air hung heavy around the Grand Regency, smelling of rain and expensive exhaust. Maya huddled deeper into her oversized hoodie, her fingers tracing the embossed eagle on her father's journal. She was hungry, a persistent hollow ache in her stomach, but her attention was elsewhere. She was focused on the driver, Chin. He was pacing near the rear of the black sedan, his movements sharp and agitated, a deviation from the calm, robotic posture he usually maintained. As he reached into his breast pocket for a cigarette, a small, white slip of paper fluttered out, dancing on a gust of wind before landing in a dirty puddle just inches from Maya's worn sneakers. Chin didn't notice. He was too busy looking at his watch, his eyes darting toward the hotel's revolving doors. Maya waited until he turned his back, then moved with the silent efficiency of a shadow. She snatched the paper from the water, retreating into the darkness of an alleyway. As she smoothed out the damp parchment, her heart began to hammer against her ribs. To anyone else, the scribbled lines looked like a series of random delivery coordinates or a grocery list. Grid 7 Bravo, 1800 Zulu, Sector 4 ignition. But Maya didn't see a list. She saw her father's handwriting in her mind, his voice echoing from the pages of his journals. This was a standard strike sequence. Her eyes scanned the cipher, her brain instinctively translating the military jargon she had studied for years. 1800 Zulu was 6 p.m. local time. Grid 7 Bravo was the exact GPS coordinate of the hotel's curb. But it was the final line that turned her blood to ice. Phase 2. Remote trigger on door seal engagement. This wasn't a delivery. It was a kill order. The military strike code was a blueprint for an assassination. The paper in her trembling hands described a remote detonated explosive that would be triggered the moment the vacuum seal of the luxury sedan's door was closed. A cold sweat broke out across Maya's forehead. She looked back at the hotel entrance. The lights were bright, the elites were laughing as they waited for their valets, and the monster of a car sat waiting like a hungry predator. She looked at the driver again. He wasn't just a servant, he was the spotter. He was the one who would confirm the target was inside before the ignition phase. Maya realized with a jolt of pure terror that the high-value target was about to walk into a metal coffin. She had less than 15 minutes before the man who didn't even know she existed became a ghost, just like her father. She didn't have a phone, a badge, or a voice that anyone cared to hear, but she had the code, and for a soldier's daughter, that was enough to go to war. Maya moved with a frantic, bird-like quickness, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped drum. The damp paper was clutched so tightly in her fist that the edges began to dissolve into a gray pulp, but the code was burned into her mind. She emerged from the shadow of the alley, her eyes locked on Chin. He was the only link she had to the world of the Grand Regency, the man who spent every day at the side of the king. To Maya, he was a protector, a fellow soldier in Junho Kang's elite guard. She assumed that if she showed him the strike sequence, he would react with the same professional urgency her father once had. He would call for a sweep, secure the perimeter, and save the man currently stepping into the elevator. "Sir, please, you have to look at this." Maya's voice was thin, cracked by the cold and the sheer weight of her terror. She reached the curb, her small frame dwarfed by the massive black sedan. Chin didn't turn at first. He stood with his back to her, adjusting his leather gloves with a slow, methodical pull. When he finally turned, his expression wasn't one of confusion or concern. He looked down at Maya with a slow, creeping smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that was sharp, predatory, and utterly wrong. "Back again, little bird," he murmured, his voice smooth and devoid of the irritation he usually showed. Maya held out the crumpled paper, her hand shaking. "It's a code, sir. A strike sequence. 1800 Zulu. The car, you can't let him get in the car." Chen's gaze dropped to the paper. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. He didn't gasp. He didn't reach for his radio. Instead, he took the paper from her hand with a terrifyingly calm deliberation. He smoothed it out, looking at the scribbled military cipher with the pride of an author reviewing his own work. Then, he looked back at Maya, and the warmth of his smile curdled into something dark. "You're a very bright girl, Maya," he whispered, leaning down until she could smell the peppermint on his breath. "Too bright for your own good. My father was a soldier, too. He taught me that in every war, there are casualties. Sometimes, the hero has to die so the rest of us can get paid." The realization hit Maya like a physical blow to the chest. He hadn't lost the paper. He had discarded it because he no longer needed the instructions. He had already memorized the death of his boss. The trusted driver was the architect of the tomb. As Chen's hand moved toward her shoulder, a grip that felt less like a greeting and more like a restraint, Maya saw the flicker of his eyes toward the hotel doors. The gold trim was moving. Junho Kang was coming. Chen's smile widened, a cold, jagged thing. "Run along now," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hiss. "Unless you want to be a part of the 1800 Zulu casualty list." Maya backed away, her breath coming in jagged hitches, realizing she was no longer just a witness. She was an enemy of the state, and the only man who could save her was the one currently walking into a trap set by his own brother-in-arms. Maya retreated from Chen's cold, serpentine gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird caught in a storm. The street felt suddenly hostile, the shadows lengthening into grasping fingers as the clock on the bank across the street flickered to 5:51 p.m. She had 9 minutes. 9 minutes to breach a fortress that had been designed to keep people like her exactly where she was on the outside. She turned away from the sedan, her sneakers slapping against the damp pavement as she lunged toward the grand, revolving gold-trimmed doors of the Regency. To Maya, this wasn't just a hotel, it was a tactical objective, and she was a soldier with a mission that the world refused to acknowledge. As she reached the entrance, the warm, vanilla-scented air of the lobby beckoned, a stark contrast to the biting wind. But before her foot could even touch the polished marble, a massive hand clamped onto her shoulder. A security guard, dressed in a suit that cost more than Maya's father had made in a month, loomed over her. His face was a mask of practiced indifference, a human wall built of muscle and narrow-mindedness. "Wrong way, kid," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration that shook Maya's very bones. "Deliveries go to the rear. Beggars don't go anywhere near the lobby." "I'm not a beggar," Maya cried, her voice rising in a desperate, frantic pitch that made a socialite nearby pull her silk wrap tighter in distaste. "I have to see Mr. Kang. It's about the car, it's about 1800 Zulu. Please, he's in danger." The guard's eyes didn't even flicker with curiosity. To him, she wasn't a girl with a warning, she was a nuisance, a glitch in the aesthetic perfection of the Grand Regency. He didn't see the fear in her eyes or the military journal clutched to her chest. He saw only the worn knees of her pants and the messy tangle of her hair. "Sure you do, honey. And I'm the King of England," he sneered, physically hoisting her backward toward the sidewalk. Maya fought against his grip, her small legs kicking at the air. She tried to dart past him, to slip through the blind spots her father had taught her about, but the lobby was crawling with secondary security. Everywhere she turned, she met a fresh wall of black suits and crossed arms. They were invisible walls, more impenetrable than steel because they were built on the assumption that someone as small and poor as Maya couldn't possibly possess anything of value, especially not the truth. She looked through the glass, catching a glimpse of the private elevator bank. The numbers were descending. 543. Junho Kang was coming down into a world that had successfully silenced his only savior. Tears of frustration and terror blurred her vision as she realized that her father's lessons on tactical infiltration hadn't accounted for a world that refused to see the soldier behind the rags. She was running out of time, and the man at the top of the empire was seconds away from walking into the void. The digital clock atop the bank tower across the street flickered to 5:58 p.m., the red numbers bleeding into the twilight like a fresh wound. Maya felt the vibration of the heavy glass doors before she saw him. The air seemed to shift as Junho Kang stepped out of the Grand Regency's climate-controlled sanctuary and into the raw, biting wind of the real world. He moved with the effortless grace of a man who owned the pavement beneath his feet, flanked by a phalanx of security that functioned like a human shield. Chen, standing by the open door of the sedan, offered a sharp, mocking nod, a predator watching his prey walk into the mouth of the cave. The trap was set. The vacuum seal of the car was waiting to become a detonator. Maya knew she couldn't go through the guards. She had to go under their radar. Utilizing the low-profile insertion tactic her father had once mapped out for dense urban environments, she dropped low, weaving through a group of high-society guests who were distracted by their own laughter. She was a blur of gray fabric and desperation. Just as Junho reached for the door handle, his hand encased in a leather glove that cost more than Maya's life, she lunged. She didn't just step forward, she breached his perimeter. Before the nearest guard could react, Maya's small, cold hand clamped onto Junho's tailored sleeve. The contact was electric, a sudden, jarring break in the billionaire's perfect routine. He stopped, his brow furrowing in a mixture of confusion and icy irritation, looking down at the homeless girl as if she were a ghost that had suddenly gained substance. But before he could shake her off or signal for her removal, Maya spoke, her voice cutting through the city noise with the sharp, rhythmic cadence of a drill sergeant. "Bravo 69er, Sector 4 ignition. Door seal engagement at 1800 Zulu." Junho froze. The irritation in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden, piercing clarity. Those weren't the ramblings of a street child. They were the specific, classified strings of a military-grade strike sequence, a code-red cipher used by the very elite contractors he often hired for his own shadows. "Target confirmed in kill zone," Maya whispered, her wide eyes locked onto his, pleading for him to see the soldier's daughter and not the beggar. "The vacuum seal is the trigger, sir. If you close that door, the code completes." Look at his pocket. Look at Chin. The silence that followed was deafening. Junho Kang didn't look at the guards. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Maya, really looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he saw a person instead of a variable. Behind them, Chen's smile faltered, his hand moving instinctively toward his waistband. The clock hit 5:59. The mission was no longer about survival. It was about the truth that only a child was brave enough to speak. The atmosphere around the black sedan instantly curdled from a scene of high society luxury into a tactical theater of war. Junho Kang did not hesitate. His mind, trained for decades to react to market shifts and hostile takeovers, pivoted with terrifying speed to the life-or-death reality Maya had just unveiled. He didn't pull his arm away from her. Instead, he placed a protective hand on her shoulder, anchoring himself to the only truth in the street. With a sharp, guttural command, he signaled his primary detail, the inner circle, guards who stood separate from the drivers. Hard perimeter. Now, step away from the vehicle. The air was punctured by the sound of boots on pavement. Junho's loyalists, sensing the shift in his voice, moved with a fluidity that was beautiful and lethal. Two guards stepped in front of Junho and Maya, forming a ballistic wall, while a third, a veteran with a background in explosives, dropped to a knee near the rear chassis of the car. He slid a telescopic inspection mirror under the frame, and the silence that followed was heavy with the scent of ozone and impending fire. When the guard looked up, his face was ashen. "IED confirmed, sir. Magnetic bypass on the door seal." "She's right." One click and we're all glass and scrap metal. Across the hood of the car, Chen's composure shattered. The predatory smile he had worn moments ago dissolved into a mask of pure, frantic terror. He saw the tactical team closing in, saw the loyalty shifting away from him like sand in a storm. He knew the penalty for failing a man like Junho Kang, and he knew even better the penalty for betraying him. Without a word, Chen spun on his heel, shoving through a crowd of bewildered tourists as he sprinted toward a waiting getaway motorcycle at the edge of the curb. But Maya's father had taught her about flanking maneuvers. As Chen reached for the bike, two of Junho's secondary guards, who had been positioned in the lobby's blind spots, intercepted him with the force of a high-speed collision. They tackled him into a stack of luggage carts, the metal clattering like gunfire against the stone. Chen fought like a cornered animal, but he was pinned, his face pressed into the cold, wet concrete he had once expected Maya to die on. Junho didn't look at the traitor. He looked down at Maya, who was trembling so hard her teeth were chattering. The red numbers on the bank clock hit 6 p.m. In the distance, a muffled click echoed from the car. The remote trigger had been engaged from a distance, but because the door seal had never been broken, the blast radius remained a dormant nightmare. Maya let out a breath she felt she had been holding since her father died. The code had been broken. The mission was over. And for the first time in 3 years, the girl who was invisible felt the warm, heavy weight of a hand on her shoulder that wasn't trying to push her away. The sirens of the arriving police units began to wail in the distance, but for Junho Kang, the world had shrunk to the few feet of sidewalk where he stood with Maya. The high-octane adrenaline of the standoff was receding, replaced by a heavy, profound silence that felt more significant than any board meeting he had ever chaired. For the first time in his life, Junho didn't look at the city as a map of assets. He looked down. He saw Maya's sneakers thin, frayed at the edges, and soaked through with the oily slush of the gutter. They were the shoes of someone who spent their life running simply to stay in place, yet she had stood her ground against a traitor that his own billion-dollar security apparatus had failed to detect. His gaze moved to the journal she still clutched against her chest. The leather was scarred, the corners rounded by years of desperate handling, and he could see the faint, handwritten name on the inside cover, Sergeant Marcus Thompson. Junho reached out, his movements uncharacteristically slow, and gently touched the weathered page. He thought of his own father, a man who had left him an empire built on steel and coldness, and then he looked at this girl, who had been left nothing but a legacy of honor and a code. He realized with a staggering sense of shame that he had walked past her 100 times, categorizing her as part of the urban noise, while she had been a sentinel, a guardian of a morality he had long ago traded for profit. "You saved me," Junho said, his voice low and devoid of its usual sharp authority. It wasn't a question, but a confession. He looked at his own polished, handmade shoes, then back at hers. The contrast was a physical ache in his chest. In his world, people only did things for a price, but Maya had risked everything, her safety, her invisibility, her very life, for a man who hadn't even known her name. She had seen a soldier in trouble and had answered the call. The weight of his debt of honor settled over him, more substantial than any financial obligation he had ever carried. He realized that the driver, the hotel, and even the empire were secondary to the fact that he was alive because of the one person he had deemed worthless. He knelt on the damp pavement, ignoring the ruin of his expensive suit, so that he was eye level with her. "Maya," he whispered, the name tasting like a new beginning on his tongue. "You aren't going back to the shadows. A soldier's daughter belongs in the light." He saw the tears finally track through the dirt on her face, and as he reached out to take her hand, he knew that the man who had walked out of the hotel at 5:58 p.m. was dead, but not because of a bomb. He was dead because the girl with the military code had finally forced him to see. The seasons turned, and the biting winter that had once threatened to swallow Maya Thompson whole gave way to a spring of disciplined growth and iron-willed purpose. 1 year had passed since the damp pavement of the Grand Regency had served as her battlefield, but the echoes of that night remained the foundation of a new life. Maya no longer stood on the periphery of the world, shrouded in a gray hoodie. Instead, she stood at the center of a parade ground, her spine as straight as a bayonet. Clad in the crisp, midnight blue dress uniform of the Kang Military Academy, a prestigious institution Junho had established for the city's gifted but forgotten youth, Maya moved with the quiet confidence of a leader. She was top of her class in tactical analysis and strategic ethics, her father's tattered journal now encased in a protective glass display in her study, its pages no longer a survival guide, but a sacred text of honor. Junho Kang watched her from the reviewing stand, his own transformation no less profound. The cold, sterile man who had once viewed the city as a series of cold acquisitions had been replaced by a man whose empire was now measured in impact rather than interest rates. He still wore the tailored suits, and he still commanded a room with a single glance, but the dangerous calm in his eyes had softened into a focused compassion. He had traded his ruthlessness for a different kind of precision, the precision of a builder. The new empire he had constructed was not made of glass towers and hidden bank accounts, but of community centers, scholarship funds, and a fierce, protective advocacy for those the world deemed invisible. He had realized that the most powerful thing a man can own is not a syndicate, but a clean conscience and the loyalty of a child who saved his soul. As the ceremony concluded, Maya broke formation, running toward Junho with a smile that carried none of the fear from their first encounter. He met her halfway, no longer kneeling to her level, but standing tall as her guardian and mentor. Around them, the city hummed, no longer a grid of threats, but a landscape of possibility. Junho looked at Maya, seeing not a street kid, but a future commander, and then he looked at the city he had once tried to conquer. He understood now that he had been wrong for 34 years. Trust wasn't a tactical error, and emotions weren't weaknesses. They were the very things that kept a man from becoming a ghost in his own life. As they walked toward the car, a vehicle that was now a symbol of safety rather than a tomb, Junho knew that the mission Maya's father had started was finally complete. The soldier's daughter was home, and the man who had been lost was finally found. The story of Maya and Junho serves as a profound reminder that the most valuable voices in our world are often the ones we choose not to hear. Maya, an invisible child of the streets, possessed a wealth of knowledge and a legacy of honor that far exceeded the billion-dollar intelligence of the man she saved. Her courage teaches us that true status is not defined by the clothes we wear or the power we wield, but by the integrity of our actions when no one is watching. Junho's transformation reveals that a life built solely on cold logic and the exclusion of others is a fragile fortress. It took the desperate grip of a homeless girl to show a powerful man that his greatest vulnerability wasn't a lack of security, but a lack of humanity. The lesson is simple yet life-changing. Never dismiss someone based on their circumstances. Wisdom transcends age, and brilliance often hides in the blind spots of our pride. When we lower our defenses and truly see the people around us, we don't just save them, we allow them to save us.